I always thought my life was the kind people envied. We had the white fence, the backyard with the swing set, the dog that barked at the mailman every morning like clockwork. My dad wore a tie to work every day and kissed my mom on the cheek. When he came home, she'd be cooking something that filled the whole house with warmth, and I'd be sitting at the kitchen table pretending to do homework while secretly doodling in the margins of my math book. My sister Lily would be humming in the living room, brushing the hair of her dolls or trying to braid her own and failing spectacularly. I didn't know it then, but those days weren't perfect because they were real. They were perfect because they were fragile. It wasn't until my 17th birthday that I noticed something off. My mom had been distant all week, like she was distracted, like she wanted to say something, but couldn't quite find the words. I figured she was just stressed. Maybe work had been rough. Maybe something with Grandma, who was in and out of the hospital every other month. I didn't press her. I should have. That night, she gave me a scrapbook wrapped in brown paper. It was heavy and thick and smelled like the attic where all the old photo boxes lived. I unwrapped it slowly, confused but curious, and inside were photos I'd never seen before. Baby pictures, toddler photos, my first day of kindergarten, me sitting on the couch with a balloon bigger than my head, but none of them felt familiar. Not the clothes, not the background, not the people. I flipped to the back, looking for something, anything that made sense, and found a note taped there, yellowed around the edges with time. It was her handwriting, shaky, not the usual neat script she used when writing grocery lists. "I'm sorry." That was all it said. I looked up at her. Her eyes were red, her lips trembling. She reached out and touched my hand, and that's when she said it. "You're not our biological child." The world didn't fall apart like I thought it would. There was no thunder, no dramatic music, no shattering glass. It was quiet, too quiet, like the moment before a scream. I didn't know what to say, so I just stared at her, trying to make sense of the words, trying to connect them to the life I had lived, and failing completely. She started to cry, then full-body sobs, the kind that take years off your life, and I just sat there frozen, like if I moved it would all become real, and I wasn't ready for real, not yet. "We adopted you when you were 2, she said through the tears. "Your mother, your real mother. She was my cousin. She couldn't take care of you, and she begged me. She begged me to raise you as my own." I don't remember standing up, but suddenly I was no longer at the table. I was in the hallway, then in the yard, then walking down the sidewalk barefoot, the cold concrete biting into my feet like punishment for something I didn't even understand. All I could hear was her voice over and over echoing in my head. "Not our biological child, not our child, not ours." I sat at the park until the sun started to come up, staring at the rusted swing set, the same model we had in our backyard, and wondering if that had been hers, if she had given it to me, if it had been some secondhand gift from a life I'd never know. When I finally went home, my dad was waiting on the porch. He didn't say anything, just opened his arms, and I collapsed into them like I was 5 years old again, and the monsters under the bed had gotten too loud. He told me he loved me, that nothing changed, that I was his daughter no matter what, and maybe I believed him for a moment, maybe I wanted to. But something inside me had shifted. There was a crack in the perfect picture, and I couldn't unsee it. I asked to see her, the woman who gave birth to me. My real mother, and my mom hesitated, but then nodded and said, "Okay, we'll find her." She didn't live far, just one town over, in a crumbling apartment building with broken elevators and a hallway that smelled like stale beer and forgotten dreams. Her name was Marie, and she looked like me, but older, thinner, more tired. Her eyes had the same shape, the same color, but none of the warmth. She didn't hug me, she didn't cry, she just looked at me like I was a ghost. "So, you finally found out," she said, not a question, just a fact laid bare on the dirty floor between us. "Why?" I asked. "Why did you give me away?" "Because I had to," she said, like that explained anything like that was enough. She offered me tea. I said no. We sat in silence for a long time, listening to the pipes groan behind the walls. Then she told me things I didn't want to hear about the man she loved, who wasn't a good man, about nights filled with shouting and fists and locked doors, about a baby she thought would save her, and how that baby only made it worse. I was that baby. And in some twisted way, I understood. But understanding doesn't erase pain. Understanding doesn't fix 17 years of a life built on silence. When I got home, I didn't speak to my mom for days, not because I hated her, but because I didn't know how to say thank you, and why didn't you tell me, in the same breath. The scrapbook stayed under my bed for weeks, unopened, unread, a box of ghosts I wasn't ready to face. And then one night I pulled it out and flipped through it again, and I saw something I hadn't noticed before, a photo taped to the inside of the back cover. It was me as a toddler, asleep in my mom's lap, not Marie, my mom, the one who raised me. Her eyes closed, her head resting on mine like she'd never let go. And for the first time, I let myself cry. After that night, something changed between us, not in a loud, explosive way, but in the quiet absence that settles between people who don't know how to talk anymore. My mom tried. She made pancakes the next morning, like always, smiled, like everything was normal, but her hands trembled when she passed me the syrup, and I pretended not to notice. My dad stayed steady like always, mowing the lawn, fixing the gutters, reading the paper, but his eyes watched me more carefully now, like he was waiting for something to break. Maybe me, maybe the whole illusion. Lily didn't say anything until 3 days later. We were in the car, just the two of us, on the way to the grocery store. She was driving and I was staring out the window when she said, "So you're adopted, huh?" Just like that, no warning, no softness, just the truth on the dashboard between us. I didn't answer and she didn't push. She just turned up the music and sang along like we were still kids, and everything made sense. At home, I started noticing things that never mattered before, like how my skin was a slightly different shade than theirs, how my baby pictures started later than hers, how there were no pregnant belly shots, no ultrasounds, no hospital bracelet in the memory box, just a birth certificate with no time, no hospital, just a name and a date. I started asking questions, but I didn't know who I was asking or what answers I wanted sometimes. I would Google things like how to find your birth family or how to feel real when everything feels fake, and I'd scroll through pages of strangers pouring their hearts into forums, and suddenly I didn't feel so alone. But that didn't make it hurt less. One night I found myself back at Marie's apartment. I hadn't planned to go there. I was just walking and suddenly I was at her door again. She opened it like she'd been expecting me, and this time she let me in without a word. Her apartment was small, cluttered full of plants and ashtrays and half-burned candles, the kind that smell like sandalwood and secrets. She sat down on the couch and lit a cigarette and gestured for me to sit across from her. I want to know everything, I said. She looked tired, older than last time. Like a year had passed instead of a week. There's not much to know, she said, but she told me anyway about how she met my dad, a man named Darren who played guitar in a band that never made it past dive bars and who drank too much and laughed too loud and hit when he got scared. She said he was beautiful in the way fire is beautiful until it burns you. He didn't want me, she said flatly, not in a way that broke her voice, but in a way that said it broke her a long time ago and she just learned to speak around the cracks. I asked her if she ever loved me. She looked at me for a long time before answering. I loved you enough to let you go, she said, and then she turned away like that was the end of the story. I didn't know what to do with that kind of love. It didn't feel like love, it felt like abandonment dressed in pretty words, but I nodded like I understood, and maybe part of me did. The next day, my mom left a letter on my bed. No envelope, just folded paper in her handwriting, not shaky like before, but firm like she needed me to hear every word. It said, I love you and I'm sorry and I never meant to lie to you, but I was scared. Scared you'd hate me, scared you'd leave, scared you'd look at me like a stranger. She wrote about how Marie showed up one day holding me in her arms, 2 years old, skinny, quiet eyes, too big for my face, and begged her to take me. Said she couldn't do it anymore, that I deserved better, and my mom said she didn't even think. She just opened her arms and held me and promised she'd never let go. And for 17 years, she kept that promise. Even when I started slamming doors and rolling my eyes and saying things I didn't mean, she kept it. Even when I broke her favorite vase and blamed it on the dog, she kept it. Even when I looked her in the eye after she told me the truth and didn't say a word. I read the letter 3 times and then folded it back and put it in the scrapbook with everything else, with the photos and the note and the ghost of who I thought I was. I didn't forgive her, not yet, but I stopped resenting her, and that was a start. I started therapy after that, not because someone told me to, but because I needed someone to help me sort through the mess in my head. The sessions were quiet at first, mostly me staring at the carpet while the therapist waited patiently. Then one day I said I don't know who I am, and the floodgates opened. She told me that identity isn't built in the womb. It's built in moments, pancakes on Saturday mornings, late-night hugs, when the monsters come back, tiny stitches of love sewn over time until it's part of your skin. And I wanted to believe her. I went back to school. I smiled when people said my name, even though it felt foreign on some days. I laughed at jokes again, started drawing again. The doodles came back, and this time they had meaning faces and trees and a girl standing in a storm without an umbrella, but smiling anyway. I visited Marie once more. She gave me a photo of her holding me as a baby. She was young in the photo, her eyes brighter, her smile softer, and in her arms I looked small and safe and asleep. I kept that photo in my wallet, not because I loved her more, but because I needed to carry the truth with me. It didn't erase the hurt, but it gave it shape, and sometimes that's enough. The first time I saw a baby after finding out I was adopted, I froze. It was at the grocery store, a young woman pushing a stroller down the frozen foods aisle. The baby had a tuft of dark hair and chubby cheeks, and he looked up at me and smiled like he knew something I didn't, and I smiled back, but my hands were shaking and I had to walk away. I started noticing babies everywhere on television, in commercials, in books. Little reminders that every one of us begins the same way, but not all of us get the same path, and that realization sat heavy on my chest like something I couldn't breathe. One afternoon, my mom asked if I wanted to visit the lake, the one we used to go to every summer when I was little, where we'd pack sandwiches and skip stones, and I'd always end up with mosquito bites and sunburn and the biggest smile on my face. I said yes, because part of me wanted to remember what joy felt like without all the questions. We didn't talk much on the way there, just listened to the radio and watched the road twist and curve through the hills. The lake looked the same as it always had, blue and wide and glittering under the sun, like it was made of glass waiting to be broken. We sat on the old wooden dock, feet dangling above the water, and my mom reached over and held my hand like she used to when I was scared of jumping in. She didn't say anything, and neither did I, but I didn't pull away, and that felt like progress. I asked her if she ever regretted it, taking me and choosing to raise a child who wasn't biologically hers, and she squeezed my hand and said never, not once, not for a second, and I believed her. I told her I was thinking about reaching out to my biological father, to Darren, to the man who left before I could ever remember his face, and her expression shifted just slightly, but she nodded and said it was my choice, that whatever I needed to feel whole, she'd support it. So I started looking. I didn't have much to go on, just a name and a vague description, but the internet is a strange and powerful thing, and after days of searching, I found a man living 3 states over, same name, same age, and when I saw his picture I knew He had my eyes, not just the color, but the shape and something in his expression that felt familiar even though we were strangers. I sent a message short, simple. I think you might be my father. I'm not asking for anything, I just want to know. He replied 2 days later, said he wasn't sure, said he'd need proof, said he didn't remember much from that time and that he wasn't proud of who he was back then, but if I wanted to talk, he'd be open to it. We set up a phone call. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might pass out when I heard his voice. It was rough, deeper than I expected, like gravel and guilt, and when he said my name, it felt like I was hearing it for the first time. He told me about his life, about the band that never made it, the jobs that didn't last, the rehab stints, the arrests, the regrets stacked up like old newspapers collecting dust in the corners of his memory. He said he wasn't ready to be a father back then, that he didn't even know how to take care of himself, let alone a child, that when Marie left he thought she'd never look back, and he never thought about the baby she carried. Not until now. I asked him if he ever wondered, and he said yes, more times than he could count, but wondering was easier than knowing, and that knowing came with responsibility and shame, and that was something he avoided like the plague. We talked for 2 hours, and when we hung up, I didn't feel better, I didn't feel worse, I just felt heavier, like I had added another layer to the story of me, and I didn't know if it made anything clearer or just more complicated. I told my mom about the call, and she just listened, didn't ask questions, didn't judge, just sat there with me in the quiet, and that was enough. Lily started acting weird after that. Not mean, just different, quieter, more distant. I finally asked her what was wrong and she said, I don't know how to talk to you anymore. You're the same but not really. It's like I don't know where you came from, and that scares me. And I didn't know how to fix that. I told her I was still me. I still remembered our late night movies, our childhood fights over nothing, our secrets shared under covers with flashlights and whispered giggles. I told her blood doesn't make a sister, love does, and we had plenty of that. She cried and hugged me so hard I thought my ribs would crack, and we were okay after that. Not perfect, but okay. The school counselor pulled me aside one day, asked if I was doing all right, said some of the teachers noticed. I seemed distracted lately. I told her the truth, or at least part of it, said I was just figuring things out. She nodded like she understood and gave me a pamphlet for a support group for adopted teens. I didn't go, but I kept the pamphlet. There was a night I couldn't sleep, so I went downstairs and found my dad in the garage tinkering with some old bike parts. He looked up and smiled like he always did and said, want to help? And I said sure, and just like that we were back in rhythm, like nothing had changed, even though everything had. He told me I used to follow him around everywhere when I was little, shadowing his every move, asking a million questions about tools and motors and how the world worked. He said I was always curious, always brave, even when I pretended not to be. I asked him if he ever thought about telling me the truth, and he said all the time, but then he'd look at me and think this is my daughter, no explanation needed. And for the first time, I saw the truth in that. Not just in his words, but in his eyes, in the way he handed me a wrench. Like we'd done this 1,000 times, in the way he called me kiddo, in the way he smiled, like he'd never stopped loving me. Not once I didn't remember picking up the pen. I must have had it already, or maybe it was always there waiting. It felt heavy, real, not like a metaphor, not like guilt, more like an invitation I hadn't earned. I sat with it for an hour before writing anything. Then, slowly, I wrote her name, Mira. I'd avoided writing it for years, always said her or my ex or someone I knew. There's power in a name, power in saying it, in admitting that this person existed not as a chapter, not as a lesson, but as someone real, someone who trusted me. The pen moved like it had something to say without me. I'm sorry I made you carry my silence. The ink bled slightly into the paper. I didn't cry. I didn't feel clean or redeemed. Just still. Like something inside me had been waiting a long time to be said aloud. That night, I didn't dream about her. I dreamed about the rain, the sound of it on a windshield, a streetlight through fog, and a figure walking backward into the dark. When I woke up, I expected the notebook to be gone. But it was still there. Open. My handwriting on the page exactly where I'd left it. I flipped forward. There were new words. Notmina. Now tell the whole truth. I didn't know what that meant. I thought I had. I thought I'd already said it all about Elise, the car, the silence, the cowardice. But if I was honest, there was one more thing. One more piece I'd never allowed to surface. See, the night of the accident? I saw the missed call. From Mira. I didn't just ignore the text, I saw her name on the screen, her face in the little contact bubble. I had time to answer. I even reached for the phone. But Elise was saying something funny. Laughing. And I let my hand fall back to my lap. And right then, I remember feeling free. I remember thinking, finally, she'll stop chasing me. She'll realize I'm not who she thinks I am. And I won't have to be guilty anymore. That thought, it was sharp. And fast. And it passed. But I had it. And now I wonder if she felt that shift. If that was the moment she turned her car around to come find me. I'll never know. But I can't pretend I didn't wish, for half a second, that she would stop loving me because it was easier than breaking her heart. That's the part I never told anyone. That's the part I tried to bury so deep it became part of my bones. The worst thing wasn't the accident. It was the relief. When that hit me, I felt sick. And yet, the moment I wrote it down, the notebook changed again. Not with words this time, but the page beneath my confession had a faint mark. Like pressure. Like someone had written on it hard enough to leave an imprint. I shaded over it with the side of my pencil. One sentence appeared. Thank you. I read it over and over, unsure if it was a trick of the light or something more. Maybe I wrote it in my sleep. Maybe it was Mira. Maybe it was just the part of myself that had waited years to finally speak. But it didn't feel like a message to me. It felt like forgiveness, and I wasn't ready for that. I think we get addicted to punishment, to guilt. We hold on to our sins like security blankets. Because if we let go, we're left with the terrifying task of moving forward. I didn't want to be forgiven. I wanted to carry it, because that felt like penance. But maybe that's just another way of hiding, another form of cowardice. I closed the notebook, laid it on the table, and just sat there. The sun was rising, bleeding light into the kitchen like a slow apology. I didn't know what came next, still don't, but I finally felt something close to quiet. Not peace, not yet, but the kind of quiet you get when the noise stops after hours of chaos. When your ears ring and you're not sure if the silence is real, but you cling to it anyway. I kept the notebook in plain sight after that. I didn't lock it away. I didn't bury it under laundry or stack it with bills. I let it breathe. Sometimes, I catch myself talking to it. Not expecting answers. Just releasing things I never said out loud. Like how I wish I'd taken more pictures of her. Or how I still remember her laugh in high fidelity. Or how I never told her that sometimes her mess made me feel less broken. I think she knew. She always seemed to know things before I did. A few nights ago, I got one last message. Not a text, not a photo. A dream. She was standing in the rain again, wearing that stupid patchwork jacket she loved. Her hair was damp, stuck to her cheeks. She looked like she did the day we meet eyeliner smudged. Eyes too bright. She didn't say anything, but this time, I did. I should have answered. She smiled, just barely, then turned around and walked toward the fog, not away from me, just forward. When I woke up, the notebook was closed. A pressed flower rested on top, one I'd never seen before. Faded purple, cracked stem, smelled faintly of lavender and ash. I didn't question it. Some secrets never need to be told, but some are only kept until we're ready to carry them without hiding. And maybe that's what this whole thing has been. Not a haunting, not punishment, but a hand, reaching backward, waiting for me to finally follow. Summer came, and with it a strange sense of stillness. Like everything had paused, like the universe was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do next. I spent most of my days walking through town past the ice cream shop where I had my first job, past the park where I fell off the jungle gym and broke my arm, past the library where my mom used to read to me every Thursday afternoon. All those places felt like pieces of me, little fragments floating just out of reach, and I kept chasing them, hoping that if I gathered enough, maybe I'd feel whole again. One day I found a box in the attic labeled Claire. It was dusty and taped shut, and I knew I shouldn't open it, but of course I did. Inside were drawings, letters, old school projects, some with gold stars, some with smiley faces in red ink. There was a card from my kindergarten teacher that said, "Claire is a bright light in the classroom and always kind to others," and I read it 3 times, like I needed to convince myself that it had once been true. At the bottom of the box was a tiny pair of shoes, scuffed and faded white with pink laces. I held them in my hands and tried to remember if I had ever worn them, if they had ever carried me across playgrounds or through grocery store aisles. Clinging to my mom's leg, but I couldn't, and that emptiness opened up in my chest again like a slow ache that never fully goes away. That night I dreamed I was a little girl lost in a store calling out for my mom, and everyone I passed had her face, but none of them stopped. None of them turned around. They just walked past me like I was invisible. And when I woke up, my pillow was wet and my hands were clenched and I couldn't remember how to breathe. I started volunteering at the community center, something to fill the time, something to pull me out of my head. I helped kids with their homework, played board games, handed out snacks. It was simple, it was good, and for a few hours at a time, I forgot to be sad. There was one little girl named Naomi who followed me around everywhere. She asked a million questions about everything. Why the sky was blue, why spiders had 8 legs, why some people looked sad even when they smiled, and one day she asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, and I laughed and said, "I think I'm already grown up," and she wrinkled her nose and said, "That's boring," and walked away. I told my therapist about her and she smiled and said maybe what I needed wasn't answers, maybe it was permission to be curious again, to not have it all figured out, and that stuck with me. One weekend, I drove out to Marie's apartment again. I didn't tell anyone, not my mom, not my dad, not Lily. I just needed to see her, to ask her something I hadn't had the courage to ask before. She opened the door, still wearing that same worn sweater, still surrounded by the same jungle of plants and shadows and incense. I sat down on the couch and looked her in the eye and said, "Did you ever think about keeping me?" She didn't answer right away, just lit a cigarette and stared out the window like she was trying to find the answer in the clouds. Then she said, "Every day," and it almost broke me. She said she used to watch other mothers at the park and imagine that was her, that she used to hold the blanket you left behind and cry until her eyes swelled shut, that she told herself she did the right thing, but some nights she hated herself for it. I asked her why she never reached out, and she said because she didn't think she deserved to that. After everything she'd done, she didn't think she had the right. I didn't forgive her, not then, not completely, but I hugged her before I left, and she held on like she was afraid I'd vanish if she let go. When I got home, my mom was waiting at the kitchen table, her eyes puffy, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of tea. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at me, and I knew she knew where I had been. She said, "I want to tell you something I should have told you years ago," and I braced myself because I didn't think I could handle another secret. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a letter, faded and folded too many times to count. amount. She slid it across the table and I opened it slowly, afraid of what was inside. It was from Marie, addressed to her, dated the week after I had come to live with them. It said, "Thank you over and over. Thank you for saving her. Thank you for loving her. Thank you for being the kind of mother I can't be." And at the end it said, "Please tell her one day. Tell her when she's strong enough to carry it." My mom said I waited too long. I was scared, and then the years just passed, and I thought maybe it didn't matter anymore. Maybe you didn't need to know, but I see now that wasn't fair. I didn't know what to say, so I just reached across the table and held her hand, and she cried. The kind of quiet cry that feels heavier than shouting, and I let her because we both needed it. That night I took the letter upstairs and read it again and again until I had it memorized, until the words didn't sting anymore, until they felt like part of my skin. Later I stood in front of the mirror and looked at myself. Really looked, and for the first time in months I didn't see a question. I saw a girl with a story. Not a perfect one, not even a whole one, but mine. And that felt like something worth holding on to. The flower stayed where I left it on top of the notebook, like a period at the end of a sentence I didn't know I'd been writing. I didn't move it. I didn't press it in a book or tuck it into a drawer. I just let it sit there, fading slowly in the open air, watching me. A part of me wanted to burn the whole thing. The notebook, the flower, the memories. Let it all go up in smoke and say it was done, that it didn't matter anymore, that I could start clean. But that would be a lie too. Some stories need to be remembered, not rewritten, not fixed, just remembered. And remembering her wasn't what hurt the most. What hurt was remembering the version of myself I had to be in order to forget her. I started walking more. No destination. Just movement. Around the neighborhood. Down quiet streets. Past places I'd never noticed before. I wasn't looking for signs, but I found them anyway. A street artist had painted a mural of two birds sewn flying, one perched, both facing opposite directions. I stood in front of it for a long time. Didn't take a picture. Didn't need to. I started carrying the notebook with me, not to write, just to have. It felt like a conversation, even if neither of us was speaking anymore. One morning, I was at a small park, watching the wind comb through a row of overgrown grass, and I saw a girl who reminded me of Mira. Not in the obvious ways, not her face or her hair or the way she walked, but something about her presence. She was crouched down, picking up leaves, studying them like they had something sacred etched into their veins. She caught me looking and smiled. "Looking for breadcrumbs?" I asked without thinking. She tilted her head. "Always," she said. It hit me like a wave. The phrase. The way Mira used to say it. This girl couldn't have known. It was just coincidence. But I felt something in my chest shift. Not panic, not grief, just recognition. I sat on the bench until she left, then took out the notebook, opened it to a blank page, and I wrote, "Sometimes the universe speaks in echoes, and sometimes it whispers in the voice of someone you used to love." After that, the notebook stayed blank. No more messages, no more new pages, just mine now, my words, my thoughts, my way of holding space for the past without letting it swallow the present. I started filling it slowly, memories, confessions, questions with no answers. I didn't write every day. Sometimes I just held it. Elise reached out a few weeks later. Just a short message. "Hey, I heard you're back in the city. Would be nice to catch up." I stared at it for a while. We hadn't spoken in years. Not since things unraveled between us, which they always had to. I used to think it was her fault, or the timing, or something outside of us. Now I know better. It was me. It was always me. Holding on to something I didn't understand, haunted by something I wouldn't face. I didn't respond to Elise right away. I didn't ignore it either. I just sat with it. The next day I sent back one line. "I hope you're well. Thank you for that night at the diner." No need to explain. She'd either remember or she wouldn't, but I needed to say it. Not for closure, not for reconnection, just for honesty. Because that's what I've been learning. Honesty doesn't undo the past. It just makes it bearable to live with. And secrets? They're just truths in exile. When you stop hiding them, they don't lose their weight, but they become easier to carry. I haven't had a dream about Mira since the night she smiled in the fog. And I'm okay with that. It doesn't mean I've forgotten. It doesn't mean I've moved on in some clean, cinematic way. It just means I've stopped trying to rewrite it all into something it never was. We were messy, and beautiful, and unfinished, and I'm still here. One night, not long ago, I left the notebook on a park bench. Not on purpose, not exactly by accident either. I watched from a distance as an older man sat down beside it. He looked at the cover, opened it, then carefully closed it again. He didn't take it, just sat with it. I never went back for it. Maybe it's still there. Maybe someone else found it. Maybe it's passing from hand to hand, gathering fragments from people like mythos who need to say what they've never said out loud. I like that idea, that maybe the notebook never belonged to me at all. That maybe it just finds people who aren't ready to speak, but are finally willing to listen. And if you're hearing this now, maybe it's your turn. Maybe you have a secret too. One that's hardened inside you like a stone, one that you've carried so long it's become part of your shape. You don't have to say it out loud. Not yet, but maybe, just maybe, you could write it down. Not for anyone else. Just for yourself. Because some truths don't want to be hidden. They want to breathe. Fall crept in like a secret, the kind you don't notice until the leaves start changing and the air bites just a little harder. I walked home from school wrapped in a sweater that used to belong to my mom, the sleeves too long, the fabric worn. soft by years of laundry and life, and I felt safe in it, like maybe no matter how much changed, some things could still stay warm. At dinner that night, Lily told us she was applying to colleges out of state. Her voice excited, her eyes scanning mine for a reaction, and I smiled and said that's amazing, and I meant it. But part of me felt a flicker of panic, like something stable was shifting again just when I had started to feel grounded. Afterward, we sat in her room, surrounded by piles of old notebooks and half-packed boxes, and she asked me if I'd ever leave this town, if I could go anywhere, and I said maybe someday, maybe when I stop feeling like I need to glue all the pieces of myself together first. She didn't try to fix it, she just handed me a piece of gum and said, "Remember when we tried to sell these to the neighbors and got yelled at for knocking too late?" And we both laughed, the kind of laugh that felt like home. At school, people stopped asking questions, they just let me be, which was all I really wanted. I wasn't the adopted girl, or the mystery girl, or the girl with secrets anymore. I was just Claire again, and that felt like healing. One afternoon, my art teacher asked me to stay after class. She said she'd noticed my drawings had changed, that there was something new in them, something raw and honest, and she asked if I'd ever considered submitting to the senior showcase. I almost said no, but then I thought about everything I'd lived through, everything I'd carried, everything I was still holding, and I said yes. I went home and pulled out my sketchbook and flipped through page after page of faces and fragments of eyes that looked like mine and didn't, and girls floating above cities or sinking into water, and I chose the ones that felt the most like truth. One piece was called Bloodless. It was a girl made of glass, her heart, a tangled mess of roots and thread and broken lines, and I didn't realize until later that it was me. I showed it to my mom and she didn't speak for a long time, just touched the paper like it might crack in her hands, and then she said it's beautiful and hugged me tighter than she had in months. The night of the showcase, I stood in the corner of the gallery, clutching a paper cup of punch, watching strangers stare at my drawings and whisper and point and nod, and I thought I might throw up. Then someone tapped my shoulder and I turned, and it was Marie. She was wearing a dark coat and her hair was pulled back, and she looked nervous, like she didn't know if she belonged. She said, "I saw the post online and I just wanted to see it. I hope that's okay." I nodded and she walked the room slowly, her eyes scanning each piece and stopping in front of Bloodless for a long time. When she turned back to me, there were tears in her eyes, and she whispered, "I'm proud of you," and I didn't know what to do with that, so I just said thank you and looked away. After she left, my mom came over and asked if I was all right, and I said I think so, and we stood there side by side looking at the girl made of glass, and for once I didn't feel like she was breaking. I started writing again. Not essays or homework, but stories. Little scenes in notebooks and napkins and the backs of receipts. Stories about girls who ran away and girls who stayed, and girls who weren't sure where they belonged, and somehow found their way anyway. One day, my dad found one of my pages on the kitchen table, and he read it without asking, and I was about to yell, but he said, "You've always had that in you, you just needed to crack a little to let it out," and I didn't even argue. College applications came and went. I sent out a few, not really expecting much, but knowing I needed to try, and when the first acceptance letter came, I cried not because of the school, but because someone out there read my story and said yes. My mom framed the letter with the college seal and the word congratulations at the top. She hung it in the hallway right next to the baby picture of me asleep in her lap, and every time I walked past it, I felt a little more real. I started to think about the future, about what kind of life I wanted, what kind of person I wanted to be, and for the first time, the answer wasn't someone else's version of me, it was mine. Lily and I spent our last summer together taking photos of everything. The diner where we had our first milkshakes, the bookstore that smelled like dust and dreams, the tree in our backyard where we buried a time capsule full of candy, and notes and promises we forgot to keep. We laughed until we cried, and cried until we laughed, and promised to call each other every Sunday, even though we both knew we'd probably forget sometimes. The night before she left for college, she hugged me and said, "You're my sister no matter what DNA says," and I whispered back, "I know," and I meant it. I used to think secrets protected us, that if we just kept quiet long enough, the past would lose interest and move on. But the truth has a strange way of lingering. It settles into the spaces between thoughts, wraps itself around the things you don't say. It doesn't demand attention, it just waits. And eventually, it outlasts your silence. These days, I walk lighter. Not because everything's been forgiven, not because I've fixed the things I broke, but because I've stopped pretending they never happened. I carry my guilt like a scar now visible, but healed over. Not something I try to hide when people look close. Every once in a while, I still wonder what would have happened if I'd answered that call. If I'd said yes, instead of maybe. If I'd told Mira the truth about how confused I was, instead of letting her love me without boundaries. But wondering doesn't rewrite history, it just sharpens your understanding of it. And I've learned that grief isn't about holding on to the pain. It's about learning to live with the absence without letting it define every breath you take. I found myself at the old part of town one weekend, near the university. I hadn't been back in years. The bookstore where she used to steal time from the world was still there, though it had a new coat of paint and new owners. The window display had a handwritten sign that read, "Words are the footprints of what we've survived." I stood there for a long time, staring at that sign. I could almost hear her voice saying it, even though I knew she never had. I walked inside and bought a notebook. Just a plain one. No lavender, no poems, no sketches from someone else's hand. This one would be mine. I didn't know what I'd fill it with. Maybe memories. Maybe stories I was too afraid to share before. Maybe nothing for a while. But it felt right to have something blank again. Not because I was erasing the past, but because I was finally done letting it write the future without me. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, new notebook open, pen in hand. No pressure. No voices. No ghost behind me. Just me. And I wrote, I don't need to be punished anymore. I just need to remember. The words didn't feel dramatic or profound. They just felt honest. I've learned that healing isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself or arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes it shows up as silence you no longer fear, as dreams that don't chase you, as mornings that feel unburdened, even if only for a moment. Sometimes it shows up in a stranger's smile that reminds you of someone you lost, or in a story you were brave enough to finally tell. I don't know who you are if you're hearing this, but I know what it's like to carry something too heavy to say out loud. And I know what it's like to believe that no one would understand, but someone always does. Maybe not perfectly, maybe not with the right words, but with the same ache, the same weight, the same silence. You're not the only one. You never were. And maybe that's the whole point of this. Not to confess to the world, not to beg for forgiveness from ghosts, but to make peace with yourself. With the version of you that made the wrong call. With the one who stayed silent when they should have spoken. With the one who loved, but not enough or too late. So if you're still holding on to your secret, I won't tell you to let it go. But maybe, let it breathe. Even if it's just for a moment. Even if it's just in a whisper. Because the things we bury never really stay buried. And sometimes, the only way out is through the page. So write it down, close the book, and let the story live. Even the broken ones deserve a place in the light. After Lily left, the house felt quieter, not empty, just softer, like the world had turned down its volume, and I could finally hear myself think. I spent mornings sitting on the porch drinking coffee, even though I still hated the taste. Watching the neighborhood wake up, dogs barking, sprinklers clicking on joggers, passing with nods and waves, and it all felt familiar but different, like I was seeing it through new eyes. My mom joined me, sometimes sitting in silence beside me, her hands wrapped around her mug and her hair pulled back in that messy way she always wore it when she was home. I asked her one day what she thought would have happened if Marie had never brought me to her doorstep, and she didn't hesitate. She said, I think I would have spent my life feeling like something was missing and never knowing what. That stayed with me. I visited Marie once more before I left for college. We sat on her balcony smoking clove cigarettes even though I didn't smoke, and watching the cars crawl by below. She gave me a photo album, not like the one my mom gave me. This one was smaller, messier, filled with Polaroids and ticket stubs and blurry images of people I didn't recognize, and a few of me as a baby in her arms on her lap, sleeping on her chest. She said, I wanted to give you something of mine, not because I expect you to love me, but because you came from me, and that means something even if it's complicated. I thanked her and we didn't hug, but we touched hands as I left, and it felt like enough. College was overwhelming in the way new things always are. Crowded hallways, strange faces, professors who talked too fast, roommates who slept too little. I felt lost for a while, but then I started finding pieces of myself in unexpected places. In the quiet of the library, in the laughter of strangers, and the scribbles on the whiteboard in my dorm. I joined a writing club not because I thought I was good, but because I wanted to be around people who understood what it felt like to carry too much in your chest and not know how to let it out. I read one of my pieces aloud once and my hands trembled the whole time, but when I finished, someone in the back said thank you, and I knew I had done something right. I talked to my mom every Sunday like I promised. We didn't always have much to say, but the sound of her voice grounded me like an anchor in a sea that kept trying to pull me under. She'd tell me about the dog, about Dad fixing the roof, about Lily calling to complain about laundry, and I'd tell her about my classes and my professor who looked like a tired owl, and the boy in the seat next to mine who kept drawing comics of dinosaurs taking philosophy exams. She sent me care packages filled with socks and snacks and little notes that said things like eat something green or I love you more than coffee, and I kept every one of them taped to the wall beside my bed like armor. One night I had a dream that I was back in our kitchen as a child, sitting at the table while my mom made soup, the smell of onions and garlic filling the air. She turned and smiled at me and said, you were always mine, you know, and I woke up, crying not out of sadness but because I believed it. Thanksgiving came and I went home. The first time in months. The house looked the same, smelled the same, but I felt different, like I had stepped back into a version of myself that no longer fit quite right, but still mattered. We cooked together, me and Mom and Dad, and even Marie, who came over with her homemade cranberry sauce and an awkward smile. Lily brought a boy none of us liked, but we pretended for her sake, and the dog barked every time someone opened the oven, and everything felt chaotic and messy and real. At dinner, my dad raised a glass and said to family, the ones we're born with and the ones we choose, and I couldn't stop the tears from coming, but no one made a big deal of it. They just smiled and kept eating and passed the potatoes like nothing was wrong. After dinner, Marie sat with me on the porch wrapped in a blanket and said, I used to think I ruined your life, and I said I used to think you abandoned me, and we both laughed a little because neither of us was completely wrong, but neither of us was completely right either. That night I lay in my old bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the versions of me that had lived in that room. The scared girl, the angry girl, the confused girl, the girl who didn't know where she belonged, and I realized they were all still part of me and always would be. And maybe that was okay. Maybe I didn't need to be just one thing. Maybe I could be all of them at once and still move forward, still grow, still become something beautiful out of all the broken pieces. Winter came fast that year. Thick clouds blanketed the sky, and the streets turned to ice overnight. Campus looked like a postcard, but felt like a trap. Every step was careful, every breath sharp. I wore 3 layers and still shivered in class. But it didn't matter because something in me felt steadier, stronger, like the cold couldn't touch the parts I had finally made peace with. One day in creative writing, we were asked to share something personal, a story that shaped us, and my heart pounded in my chest as I debated saying no. But then I stood up anyway, hands shaking, knees weak, and read a piece I had written about family, about how it can be made and unmade, about how truth can destroy but also rebuild. And when I finished, the room was quiet for a full 10 seconds before someone clapped, and then another, and then everyone, and I sat down with my cheeks burning in my chest, lighter. After class, a girl named Hannah caught up with me, said she was adopted too, said she'd never told anyone until now, said my story made her feel seen. We sat on a bench outside the library watching snowfall and talked for hours about belonging and fear, and how sometimes the people who raise you aren't the ones who bring you into the world, but they matter just as much, maybe more. She became my first real friend in college, not because we were the same, but because we both understood what it felt like to be caught between stories and still write our own anyway. Back home, things kept shifting in small ways. Lily called more often, her voice brighter, like distance gave her the space to grow into herself. My dad took up woodworking again, sending me photos of lopsided stools and uneven birdhouses with proud captions. My mom started painting something she hadn't done since before I was born, and her canvases were strange and beautiful and filled with color. Marie got a new job at a thrift store part-time, just enough to keep busy. She texted me sometimes funny things, weird customers, blurry photos of vintage dresses that reminded her of the 80s. And once she sent me a photo of a music box, said she used to have one, just like it used to play it for me when I cried. And I stared at that message for a long time before replying. I don't remember, but I like knowing that you did. Spring returned like forgiveness, soft rain, green buds, students on the lawn, reading, laughing, spinning in circles like the world had never been hard, and maybe for a moment it hadn't been. I spent more time outside filling sketchbooks with clouds and buildings and hands holding hands, hands letting go, hands reaching toward something, and I didn't always know what the drawings meant, but they felt honest, and that was enough. My writing professor pulled me aside one day, said he saw something in me, something raw and clear and maybe painful but real, and asked if I had ever thought about telling my story not just in class but for others, and I said maybe, and he said when you're ready, people will need to hear it. I called my mom that night, told her about the professor, and she said I've always known you had something to say, you just needed to live enough life to say it, and I think you have, and I didn't cry, but I wanted to. Later that week, I sat down and wrote the first page of something new, not a journal, not a school assignment, but a story beginning with I grew up in the perfect family, and I didn't stop writing until the sun started to rise. I sent a copy of that first draft to Lily, and she called crying, said it was the best thing I'd ever written, said she never knew how much I'd been holding, and I told her, neither did I, not really. A few days before finals, I walked past a bookstore downtown and saw a little girl through the window sitting cross-legged on the carpet flipping through a picture book, her mom watching nearby, and something about the scene hit me so hard. I had to stop and sit on a bench across the street, hands pressed against my chest as a wave of emotion rolled over me. I wasn't sad, not exactly, more like overwhelmed by the sheer weight of everything I had lived through and everything still ahead of me, and how fragile and precious and impossible and beautiful it all was. That night, I wrote a letter to my mom and dad, not because anything was wrong, but because I wanted them to know that no matter how I got here, no matter what blood did or didn't connect us, I was theirs and I always would be. I mailed it with shaky fingers and a full heart. Summer break came, and with it a strange mix of excitement and fear. Part of me was ready to go home to sleep in my old bed, to hear the creak of the stairs and the hum of the dishwasher and my dad singing off-key in the garage. But another part of me was afraid I'd walk through the front door and feel like a stranger again, like the house had moved on without me. But when I stepped inside, my mom pulled me into a hug so tight I couldn't breathe, and then laughed and said I missed your mess, and my dad handed me a sandwich already made the way I liked it, and the dog barked and licked my legs, and everything felt exactly right. That night I sat in my room looking at the bookshelf lined with the same paperbacks I had dog-eared 100 times, and the corkboard filled with old photos, me and Lily in Halloween, costumes me and my parents at the beach, one with Marie, from my graduation, and I realized that home wasn't a place. It was people, and I had more than one, and maybe that was okay, maybe that was a gift. Lily came home a week later with boxes of laundry and a new haircut and stories about her roommate who collected crystals and swore she could read dreams. We stayed up late like we used to, eating cereal straight from the box and talking about the past and the future and all the things in between. She asked me if I still talked to Marie, and I said yeah, sometimes, and she said that was good, and I knew she meant it. One morning we found our old time capsule buried under the tree in the backyard. The one we had forgotten about for years. We opened it with dirt under our nails and hearts pounding, and inside were tiny plastic toys, candy wrappers faded. Notes, one from me that said, I hope I'm brave when I grow up, and one from Lily that said, I hope I never lose my sister. We read them in silence, then laughed until we cried, then cried until we laughed, and I thought if I could freeze this moment, I would keep it in my pocket forever. I spent the summer helping my mom in the garden, planting tomatoes and pulling weeds and getting dirt under my nails. She told me stories I'd heard 1,000 times and some I hadn't, like how the first time she held me I wouldn't stop crying, until she sang the wrong lyrics to a lullaby, and then I laughed so hard I hiccuped for 10 minutes. She said I've never known anyone else's child to do that, and then she winked, and I rolled my eyes but smiled anyway. I visited Marie every other weekend. Sometimes we talked, sometimes we didn't. Once we watched a thunderstorm from her porch, and she said storms make me feel less alone, and I said me too, and we sat in silence for a long time. She showed me pictures of her when she was my age, wild hair, ripped jeans, eyeliner like armor, and I saw myself in her, and not just in the shape of our faces, but in the fire behind our eyes, in the questions we both carried like stones. Toward the end of summer, she gave me a necklace, said it was her mother's, said she had been saving it for me even before she knew if she'd ever see me again. And I wore it not because I owed her, but because it felt like another thread in the tapestry I was weaving out of truth and time and love. College started again and everything felt easier this time, not because it was simpler, but because I was stronger. I had learned how to hold the broken pieces without cutting myself and how to share them without shame. I wrote more submitted pieces to magazines, to contests, to blogs, and some got rejected, but a few didn't, and I taped the acceptances on my dorm wall next to my mom's notes and Marie's Polaroids and Lily's post-it that said you're not allowed to quit unless you're quitting something bad. I called home often sometimes just to hear the sound of someone saying my name without questioning where it came from, sometimes to talk about nothing at all. One day I got an email from a publishing site. They had read my short story and wanted to feature it, and I stared at the screen for so long I forgot to breathe. The story was about a girl who found out she didn't belong and then realized she did, and when I read it again, I saw myself on every page. I called my mom first and she cried and then laughed and then said I told you so. I called Marie next and she said I'm proud of you, and I didn't know how much I needed to hear that until I did. At the end of the semester I stood on a stage and read my story aloud to a room full of strangers, and when I looked up I saw my mom and dad in the back row holding hands, and I saw Lily grinning like she might burst, and I saw Marie leaning against the wall, eyes glassy, arms crossed like she was holding the world in her chest. And for the first time in my life I didn't feel like a girl split in two, I felt whole. Years passed the way. They always do, slow until they're gone, fast until you're looking back wondering how you ever fit inside those old rooms, those old fears, those old dreams. I graduated with a degree in writing, a heart full of gratitude, and a story that still wasn't finished but finally felt like mine. I moved to a small apartment in the city, the kind with cracked tile and creaky stairs and a window that overlooked nothing in particular, but I loved it because it was mine. I filled it with books and plants and hand-me-down furniture from home and art from thrift stores that made no sense, but made me feel seen. I started working for a magazine, writing articles about people, about places, about finding light in strange corners. I wrote under my name Claire Wilson. No asterisks, no disclaimers, just me, and that felt right. Every Sunday I still called my mom. She still asked if I was eating vegetables, still sent me socks in the mail, still called me her girl like she always had, and I let her because she is. I visited Marie too, not as often, but enough we'd go for coffee or sit on her porch or browse flea markets where she always found something ridiculous to buy. Once it was a ceramic duck wearing a bow tie. She said it looked like it had secrets. And we laughed until our stomachs hurt. Lily moved out west, started working at a startup, something with design and too much coffee. We talked every week, sometimes more. She had a girlfriend now, someone kind and clever who made her laugh in ways I hadn't heard in years. I met her once and hugged her twice and told Lily I was proud of her. She told me I'd always be her compass, and I didn't say anything, but I felt it in my bones. I published my first book, a collection of short stories, most of them fiction, some of them less so. I didn't name names, but I didn't hide either. I wrote about identity, about family, about the ache of not knowing and the miracle of being loved. Anyway, and when I held the first printed copy in my hands, I cried alone in my kitchen, surrounded by dishes and silence and joy. The dedication read for my mothers, both of them, and it was the truest thing I'd ever written. One day I got a letter in the mail from a girl in Ohio. She said she'd read my story and for the first time didn't feel broken. She said she was adopted too, and scared and angry and full of questions. But reading my words made her feel less alone, made her feel like maybe being a question wasn't the worst thing after all. I sat with that letter for a long time, thinking about how words could stretch across states and strangers and still make someone feel held, and I wrote her back not because I had answers but because I knew how much it meant to be seen. I was at home for Thanksgiving again. My parents' house still smelled like cinnamon and coffee and something baking that probably wasn't ready yet. We played board games, we watched old movies, we argued over what year a song came out and who stole the last piece of pie, and everything felt perfectly ordinary in the best possible way. That night, my mom came into my room, sat at the edge of the bed like she used to when I was little and couldn't sleep, and she said, "I don't know if I've ever said this the right way, but thank you for choosing us, for letting us be your family. Even when it hurt, even when it was messy." And I said, "I didn't choose anything, you chose me, and that made all the difference." She kissed my forehead, and I let her. Later, I stood outside under the stars, wrapped in an old blanket, listening to the quiet of a house full of people I loved, and I thought about the girl I had been, the one sitting at the kitchen table on her 17th birthday, staring at a scrapbook. She didn't recognize the one who ran barefoot through the night, chasing a truth she hadn't asked for. She was still here, still part of me, but she wasn't scared anymore, she wasn't broken. She was growing, she was writing, she was loved, and maybe that was all she ever needed.